exposure. We asked for some feedback, and we did receive a lot of feedback, and I will tell you something more about how the Standards Board dealt with all these comments as well. Then John will take over to dive with you into the content, into the different domains, and then I indeed will come back to tell you something more on the other things that are impacted by the new Global Internal Audit Standards, like, for instance, the quality assessments, the certifications, and there is this important other part coming up, the topical requirements. But first, something on the process. What I would like to emphasize here again is that there is sometimes a bit of misunderstanding that the standards are developed by the IIA staff. We have helped and supported the Standards Board a lot, but actually it's very important to know that there are two independent bodies in charge of developing the standards. And the most important one is obviously the Standards Board, the IISB. They are the one developing the standards. These are all very experienced people, certified people, audit practitioners, representing the different parts of the world. So they have a mandate of 3 years, renewable ones. And these people are then the ones gathering, discussing, and developing the content of the standards. Then we also have our Oversight Council, the IPPF Oversight Council. This body is not so much looking into the content, but they are more supervising whether the Standards Board does follow the due process. They had some in-person meetings with the Standards Board. They have been looking into the documentation, and they have been obviously mainly focusing on whether the Standards Board took into considerations all the comments that we have received. And this body actually consists of some eminent standard setting bodies, like for instance, OECD is there, World Bank, NECD, some other organizations. But as I said, they are the ones not so much looking into the content, but supervising the process. And they will elaborate a project as a report as well to mention that they approved the Global Internal Audit due process. Important here probably as well is to mention the right side of the slide. There you see our stakeholders. I think it's very important to know as well that these standards were not developed in isolation. We had throughout the whole process a lot of periods where we collected input and feedback from internal as well as from external stakeholders. Indeed, we took into consideration all the needs and expectations from the broader audience. A challenging process, a project that has been started and initiated almost 3 years ago by the Standards Board. And actually, when they started, they invested a lot of time and efforts in reflecting very thoroughly on how the new standards needed to look like. Because this was not just a regular update as we have done in previous periods. This was a very thorough review. We actually started from scratch. So we collected all input from audit practitioners because we sensed that the current standards or the previous 2017 standards did no longer address the real needs of the audit profession. And the conclusion there from all these stakeholder sessions was that the standards need to have a more simplified structure because with all these updates, the structure became a bit not coherent. We had these all loose standing parts that were not coherent anymore. A quite complex structure, also not so user-friendly to use. The Standards Board also had as an objective to make the standards more as a communication tool, to clarify to internal auditors what is expected from them, but also to have it as a tool to explain to the outside world to what internal audit stands for and how we add value to our organization. So with all that information, they started developing the new standards. And I think that a very important moment as well was that last year in March, when the Standards Board had this draft ready and they opened it for exposure to provide all internal audit practitioners as well as external stakeholders with the opportunity to provide again feedback on the draft. The main tool that we used was a survey, and we received a lot of comments. And of course, everything was taken into consideration and reviewed by the Standards Board. With all that, they arrived then to draft the final draft, which they approved in December last year. And then the due process was thoroughly reviewed by the IPPF Oversight Council and was also approved. Also, last year, we started already working on the topical requirements, and I will tell you something more when I come back later on in the presentation. This is this third mandatory part that we will have now in the IPPF framework, the topical requirements. And we have actually a pilot, a draft ready on cybersecurity. Now, beginning of this year was an exciting moment as well. January 9th, we published the new standards, and fortunately, the reactions that we received up to now are very positive. Also, still a lot of work to be done now. With support of our affiliates, we have started now translating the standards. The standards will be issued in the different languages. We will have an ebook as well. Hopefully, we will have that one ready by March. And then a lot of work here behind the scenes as well by our MCNL department, because obviously all our trainings need to be updated as well. And then later on this year, we will also expose the topical requirement on cybersecurity, hopefully by March, April this year. And the due process for topical requirements will be quite similar as for the standard. So there will be an exposure period, and then it will be adjusted again, and hopefully then published by the end of this year. Our famous red book, the paper version of the standards, will come out by the summer break, hopefully. And then, as I mentioned already, the quality assessments are impacted, so we have to update our manual there as well. And then another very important key milestone that is coming is, as already mentioned by Alistair, is next year, June 9th. The standards will become effective 1 year after publication date, which is then January 9th, 2025. So I would strongly encourage to already dive into the standards and start preparing. Now, as I mentioned, March last year was a very important and very busy, intense period for us, because then we opened the period for exposure to provide everyone with the opportunity to provide feedback. Our main tool that we used there was the survey, a survey which we translated into different languages together with the standards. Of course, they were also, the draft version was also translated into all these languages. And via this survey, we collected actually more than 1,600 replies, which is impressive, even more impressive if you look into the numbers of representatives that were coming from organizations. So we had over 400 organizations answering the survey. So actually the scope, or I would say the people that we reached via the survey was much broader than just the absolute numbers there. We had within this survey some mandatory questions, but also people could comment on the more granular, detailed level, on the level of the standards. And via that, we collected actually almost 19,000 comments on the very detailed level, which was a very intense work because all these comments were actually reviewed. Also, some came in different languages, so also a lot of translation work there to be done. We also received manual letters from some organizations, which were taken into consideration. And as I mentioned, throughout the whole process, we had different stakeholder sessions with external parties because they were more difficult to reach via our survey. As I was mentioning, in this survey, we had some mandatory questions, and the objective there was mainly to poll on the more general level of agreement or disagreement with the content of what is in these different parts and domains now. And we were happy to see that we had general consent on already within the draft version on what is in there. However, you see there that obviously there is some disagreement, and that is where we dived into the details. So with all these comments, or after the first round, I would say with the first 300-400 comments that we saw coming in, we saw already recurring themes. So the standards board then reviewed all the themes, and we reviewed all the comments, and we put them then into these different themes. And that is how it was possible to do as well a quantitative count on all the comments that we saw coming in within these different themes, as well as then further on in the process to review really what is in the content, what is in the comments, why do people not agree, so more the qualitative side of reviewing the comments. Now, the surprise maybe there is to see that the main the highest level of disagreement was on the domain 3, where we had a lot of the must statements for the board, which was pretty new in the standard. So we were addressing now the boards and also a level that is probably not familiar to our internal audit audience. So we received quite a lot of pushback there, but I'm sure that John will tell you more on how the standards board dealt with that in the final version. So important to know is that on the website, we have now the new standards with a condensed version as well, because one of the comments that we received is that now by integrating all the practical guidance, the standards have become too long, too extensive as a document to run through. And that is why we have provided with this condensed version as well to really show that actually the mandatory part of the standards has not become longer. You will find there all the requirements and then the considerations. You can dive into the full version. The two-way mapping is coming as well. And also then the report, I was already mentioning that there is the due process, and you will find all the information there on the due process, as well as all the different teams that the standards board has treated, with the rationale why certain changes were made or why certain changes were not made based on the comments that we have seen coming in. So I guess that is mainly it on the due process. I think that now, Alistair, we might already open the floor already for some questions.
Absolutely. Maybe stop sharing your presentation,
yes.
Katleen, and we can see if there are any questions that anybody wants to raise.
There we go.
So if you want to raise your hand to ask anything, I can then allow you to ask a question, or you can put it in the chat or the Q&A function. But I'm not seeing any at the moment. Oh, here we go. So what about the effective date for the new standards? When is it?
So it's going to be January 9th, 2025. So they will become effective 1 year after the publication day. We published at January 9th this year, 2024. So we have a full year, 12 months now to implement. So the effective date is January 9th, 2025.
Okay. So the expectations that internal audit units will be up and running with them as on the 9th of January 2025, and that they're applying all the requirements on that date.
That's what we expect, yes. And that's why we are developing as well now other tools, these two-way mapping and readiness assessment tool, where people can start to look and dive into where there might be potential gaps and start preparing them for implementation by the beginning of next year.
Okay, so the two-way mapping will show whether the old standards are translated into the new standards. I presume that's the case?
Yes, it's a two-way. So we have the 2017 version compared to the 2024 new Global Internal Audit Standards and vice versa. Okay. And it was due to come out last week, but due to some small technical issues, it will be this week.
Okay.
So please check our website on more information there.
And all these goods will now be open public goods, because remember the previous version of the standards, you could get the framework, but you couldn't get the detailed standards. But everything seems to be open now, and so that will be the same with the two-way guide and then the readiness tool as well.
Yes.
Okay, which is very positive for us who are not members of the IIA.
I know. I know.
Members of other things. John, you've got a question.
Thank you, Alistair. Katleen, you mentioned the cybersecurity topical requirements. What other ones are currently sort of on the books and planned?
So I will come back to that later on when I come back on the topical requirements, but I can already reveal that the next one will probably be on third-party risk. So, yeah.
Interesting subjects. Thank you.
Yeah. And in the questionnaire, the survey, there was a question as well on the topical requirements, the level of agreement on whether you want these topical requirements, as well as on topics. So to prioritize, we have based ourselves on the results of that survey. We had a dedicated survey on the topical requirements as well. We are looking into trends like risk in focus. So to prioritize, we use a lot of input as well to develop the next ones.
Okay. We've got a question about where the standards are, where they can be found. I'm going to just put a link into the chat to the answer, type the answer to find where you can find it. I'll put it in the here. Send, let's open that. I'll put it in the chat as well, actually. Probably just to cover myself off. I'm just posing a link to the actual PDF version of the standards if anybody wants to go from the IIA's website. If anyone's looking for them. Okay, any other questions before we move on to the next session? Okay. Oh, I've got one. Actually, I forgot. Translations, which might be important for some of our colleagues. Is there a schedule for when the translations will be ready or planned, or is that just depending on the local institutes?
It depends on the local institutes, unfortunately. We have put a deadline and we strongly encourage them to have them ready by end of March,
Okay.
which will probably be for the most of the institutes be feasible, but there might be some delays there as well. It's very difficult for us to manage that.
Okay.
It's out our span of control, I would say.
I know the feeling. Okay. Well, thank you for that, Katleen, and we'll come back to you later when we come to seeing what's happening next and some of the other issues that we briefly mentioned. So now I'm going to hand over to John Chesshire, who's currently coming to us live from Yerevan in Armenia. So John, I'm looking forward to hearing where the main changes are and what your personal view of the requirements will be in terms of these standards for internal auditors and internal audit functions. So hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Alistair, and thank you too for the presentation, Katleen. I found that really interesting, and I must admit I don't envy you having to deal with thousands of internal auditors around the world over something that many people care so much about. Must have been a really tough job, but I think the final product is really, really good, and I'm certainly getting to grips with aspects of these new standards myself. I'm actually conducting a readiness assessment this week of an internal audit team using these new standards because they were very keen to kind of get the process underway. So finding my way through them sort of as we speak. But thank you very much indeed. And I think that the teams there have done a tremendous job in taking the feedback, interpreting it, and then developing a final version that I think really does help our profession move forward. My part of this presentation this afternoon is very much a personal view. Obviously, Katleen works for the Institute, and over very many years, I've sort of worked with a number of different chapters around the world. I think the latest count is something I think I worked with about 14 different chapters. But the views that we have in this presentation are very much my own views. So it's a personal view, not a sort of IIA endorsed view. So just to make that clear, it's based upon my readings of the standards so far. And I'll reserve the ability to change my mind and develop my thinking as I get more familiar with these and as more information comes out in due course. So very much a view of the main changes and then where I think the standards will require more from us as internal auditors and from internal audit teams. I think we're probably all pretty familiar with the structure of the old international professional practices framework. We had these separate elements that Katleen described, and this sort of desire to rethink the approach and to make the sort of new framework a little bit more user-friendly, a little bit more modernized, a little bit more streamlined. And so we've evolved from what we see on the left-hand side into the new sort of imagery and structure on the right-hand side. For our purposes today, the bits that I'm going to focus on really are those 5 main elements in blue in the middle of our sort of circle. Purpose of internal auditing, ethics and professionalism. It's the third domain that Katleen mentioned as sort of raising some questions that governing the internal audit function. And then, so that'll probably be a little bit more familiar to many of us because they haven't changed in large measure. The kind of managing the audit function and then carrying out our work, they're performing the internal audit standards. So the new framework, 5 main elements, the 5 blue parts in the middle of there. The way these 5 elements are sort of broken down then, we have these 5 domains. Within the domains, we have 15 sort of high-level principles. Well, an evolution perhaps from the core principles that we had at the last update, the 2017 update of the IPPF. The main element that we'll be talking about today are the standards, 52 of them now, sort of structured in line with these 5 domains, sitting nicely under each of these principles. Structure is that there are clear requirements for each of these standards and considerations on how we may go about implementing these standards as heads of audit and as internal audit teams. And something that I think is really quite useful, sort of examples of the sorts of things we can use to evidence our conformance with each of these standards. Examples such as minutes or plans or records of activity, these sorts of things. So it gives us some ideas of the sorts of things that are used to kind of demonstrate that we're aligned to each of these standards. And there's a range of additional features too. These fundamentals that talk about small audit functions, about us working in the public interest, and of course the sort of public sector elements that are being sort of moved into a separate section at the end of the sort of standards. Glossary has been updated and refreshed. There's been some changes to previous definitions. Of course, the introduction of new definitions for some of the new elements that we'll see within the standards. So do check out the glossary, make sure that you're familiar with the terms, look to see what's new and what's changed, of course. The sort of detail that sits beneath that high level picture, we've got our 5 domains. Purpose I'll talk just a little bit about shortly. The second domain really sort of takes the old code of ethics, dates it, refreshes it, and includes it sort of within the body of the standards. So no separate code of ethics this time. The main headings there, the main principles there, pretty familiar. I think the new Global Internal Audit Standards much more about evolution rather than revolution. And each of those terms will be familiar, I'm sure, to all of you. Integrity, objectivity, competence, confidentiality, 4 elements from the previous code of ethics. And then the sort of due professional care has been woven into this part, this domain, and brought in there rather than within the attribute standards that we had it in previously. The third domain, governing the internal audit function. This is really about our relationship with the board, with our governing body, if we're in the public sector, with our ministers, with the audit committee, whoever is responsible for that governance over the internal audit function. And there is some obligations on us as heads of audit, chief audit exec, audit leaders, to be working with our governing bodies more closely, really to raise their awareness and understanding of what a modern sort of leading edge internal audit function can be doing, what it should be doing, how it operates, its focus on risk and adding value, the idea of delivering insight, foresight, assurance and advice, really trying to raise awareness amongst our senior stakeholders so that they can get the best service from us as internal auditors that really helps the organisation focus on the important things, focus much more on strategic issues and key risks, move away from some of the old-fashioned audit work that we used to do, and really begin to kind of make a positive difference in our organisations. Do that, and to do that well, we need to be positioned independently, and we need to have a close and productive relationship with our key stakeholders at senior levels in the organisation, governing the internal audit function. Fourth part is a little bit sort of back to us and how we work as heads of audit and as audit management teams. It does highlight the importance of a strategic plan for internal audit. I'll come on to that in just a little while. But it also covers some of the sort of more familiar areas that were sort of in the previous standards, but have evolved quite successfully here. There's principles around managing resources, financial resources, human resources, and technological resources, each of which are critical to the success of any modern internal audit service. Principle 11 sort of talks about how we communicate with our stakeholders. It highlights the importance of effective, positive relations. It highlights the importance of the quality of our communications and the way that we can use this to sort of influence for the positive governance, risk and control in our organizations. Principle number 12 covers off quality from the perspective of the chief audit exec and how we work with our stakeholders when it comes to things like external assessments and the sort of periodic assessments against the International Professional Practices Framework. It also covers off the importance of improvement. And I think too many audit functions focus on the sort of quality assurance element, particularly at an engagement level, and then don't put sufficient attention and focus on the more strategic elements of quality, and also on the improvement actions that we should all be identifying as we strive to continuously improve the services that we deliver. And then the fifth and final domain, it's the element really that hasn't changed quite so much in my opinion. It's about how we undertake our internal audit engagement, whether it's assurance or advisory. It highlights the importance of planning and what we need to include within our internal audit plans, objectives, scope, key risks, all of the sorts of things that we could have been doing before. How we carry out the engagements, the focus on field work and evidence and information, gathering that, the importance of professional skepticism, the importance of root cause analysis. And we'll touch upon some of these things later. And the end of the audit process, of course, how we communicate our results, our conclusions, our findings, how we work with management to agree the next steps, and how we track progress towards the implementation, our recommendations or agreed actions as time goes by. So 5 key domains, 15 high-level principles, and underpinning each of these principles, a range of standards. Now, what we're going to go on to next for about 35 minutes or so, I'm going to take a look at some of the standards with you that sit underneath each of these domains. I'm not going to cover all 52 of them, don't worry. Not even I can talk that quickly. But I've picked out some of the standards that have perhaps changed the most, maybe standards that have introduced new ideas or new concepts, or standards where I think we're going to have to respond a little bit more thoughtfully as internal auditors and internal audit teams. Ones that perhaps raise the standard or raise the bar, the ones that perhaps will require us to change or think about changing how we operate. So it's not going to be all of the standards. It's just the ones where I think the challenge for us is a little bit higher. Just to repeat the point, these are my personal views. So if you're sitting comfortably, let's carry on then. So the main one is the position and purpose of internal audit. I'm not going to read out every single word. You can have access to the slides, I'm sure, afterwards. But this is about how we, as a as a function within an organization, strengthen our organization's ability to develop value. It strengthens our organization's resilience. It helps the organization be more productive, be more profitable, to be more economic, efficient, and effective in the way it delivers its goods, services, products. It's the way it manages risks more effectively. And our role in all of this is not to do this for the organization, but it's to provide the board and our key management stakeholders with the things that we do best. Vision of independent assurance, a vision of risk-based work, where we ought to be spending more of our time looking at higher, more impactful areas of risk, and less of our time doing some of the sort of old, traditional, low impact, low probability kind of audit work that we used to do 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago. We should be focusing on the things that matter. And of course, we've been doing a risk-based approach to internal auditing for many years. The previous IPPF talked about it. But I'm not sure that every internal audit service, every board, have really got to grips with the risk-based element quite as well as they should have done, and as much as they should have done. So an opportunity to kind of refresh our approach to a risk basis of our work. Then the purpose statement talks about four other things that are really important for us. Because of our independence, because of our risk-based focus, we're able to provide this objective assurance. And we know, I hope, quite a lot about assurance work. But also three things that are important too. Advice. Now, on the previous IPPF, we will have seen the words consulting or consulting services. And this is one of the elements that has changed. So we've replaced the term consulting with this term advice, and consulting services with advisory services. Now, too many audit teams just focus on the assurance side of our work. And I know that many people are a little bit nervous about providing advice. I think the purpose statement makes it very, very clear. We can provide objective assurance. We can provide objective advice. And there is a place for both tools within our internal audit toolbox. And part of our challenge as heads of audit, internal auditors, is to pick the right tools for the right job. So don't be quite so nervous about advisory work. Done well, that can add as much value as assurance work in the right circumstances. And then two other words that I think are really interesting. We've got this word insight, and the word insight, you'll remember, was first introduced in the mission statement in the previous IPPF. It's not defined in the glossary, but insight for me sort of makes me think a little bit about wisdom, about wise thoughts. It makes me think about joining up the dots, bringing something new to the show, maybe doing some analysis that nobody else has done before, and presenting new facts and findings to our stakeholders. Too often internal audit can be criticized for not telling us anything new or telling us stuff that we know already. Well, insight is about going beyond that, I think. It's about sitting back and thinking about root causes. It's about looking for themes in internal audit reports and findings, and then sort of exploring these and evaluating these in a little bit more detail. A real opportunity to add something new and impress our stakeholders. And the final word that I'm going to mention of this slide here, it takes it a step further, and it's this word foresight. Now, we had some words in the previous IPPF about us being proactive, about us sort of, thinking about emerging risks. And I think foresight is a little bit about sort of predicting. It is about looking over the horizon. It is about being aware of the changing environments in which our organizations exist. And it's about sort of, assessing this, analyzing this, throwing this into to our thinking and beginning to draw conclusions to support decision making in our organizations. If this happens, if that happens, we've got a real problem. These are the risks that we could face as an organization. And this is what we believe you need to be beginning to do to get ahead of the challenges here. So there's no point in us as internal audit just looking backwards or looking at what's happening in our organizations today. Both of those are important, but the things that are really troubling the board and other senior stakeholders are often the things that are coming along in the future, the things that are downstream, the things that we haven't worked out how we're going to address or deal with yet. So foresight is a real challenge for us to begin to play more effectively in that sort of area. Okay, I'm going to move on. We mentioned the first domain. This is the sort of ethical elements of the new standards. Brings in the sort of professionalism. You can see the actual standards underneath each of the 5 principles here. Some of them very similar to what we had previously, evolution, not revolution, but some new elements to some of these and new dimensions to some of these. So the ethics and professionalism domain, 5 key principles, and what we got 6, 7, 8, 19, 11, 13 standards. So picking out some of these standards just for you to have a little look at. Perhaps the standard that I am a little bit geeky, the standard that interests me the most in these new global internal audit standards. And that's this idea of honesty and professional courage. Now, honesty has been, I suppose, part of our code of ethics and our ethical approach for many years, whether we call it integrity or honesty. But the word used here is honesty. But it's this bit about professional courage that really, really impressed me. I know many auditors, and I know many auditors who have been very courageous in their work to the point of getting fired. Sadly, in some countries around the world, we know that internal auditors and external auditors have been killed doing their job too well. Now, I don't think we're quite most of us are not facing those kind of challenges, but we do face challenges when we're dealing with senior stakeholders and in how we raise findings with them, we discuss performance with them. It takes courage to raise, to communicate, and to stand our ground. When we have the evidence, we shouldn't be afraid to present that evidence and, as it says here, to communicate truthfully, take appropriate action, even when we know the messages won't be received well. Okay? And I've personally faced many difficult situations and dilemmas, many situations where I've had to call out poor performance, poor behavior, where I've had to say to senior managers, you need to stop right now and calm down. It's not easy, it's not fun, it's not difficult, it's very difficult. But it's critically important for us and for our teams to have the courage to do our job to the very best of our abilities and to face these difficult situations and to deal with them appropriately and professionally. Critically important. So I'm delighted to see this standard in here. Just to pick on a couple of the other words that I've put in bold here. If you are a head of audit or a chief audit exec, then you have a particular role to play here, particularly in terms of creating and maintaining an environment where your team feel supported, particularly when they're having to present the results of the audit work themselves. And they need to know that you have their back, that you're the top cover and support, and that will allow them to you know, deal with these situations with a little bit more resilience and a little bit more confidence if they are confident that you're there to support them and assist them in doing their job to the best of their abilities. Really important. Just a couple of things at the bottom. I want you to, after today and over the next few months, as you begin to develop up your approach, and I wrote down something Katleen said earlier. I thought it was brilliant. As you dive into the standards and start preparing for them, that's what we should all be doing. So, I'd be wanting you to think a little bit about how you're going to achieve this in practice. How you're going to encourage your team to behave with courage, and how you're going to demonstrate that yourselves, and how you're supporting them and creating a culture within the audit team where they feel supported and they're able to have those difficult conversations with their auditees and audit clients. Okay, I'm going to move on because there's a few more that I want to cover. Standard 1.2 is talking about ethical expectations. If we just look at the words in bold here, if we as internal auditors identify behavior within the organization that is inconsistent with the organization's codes of conduct, codes of behavior, values, or its ethical expectations as a whole, we must report the concern according to applicable policies and procedures. Right? So if we discover inappropriate behavior and conduct, misconduct that doesn't align with cultural values or behaviors or expected culture values and behaviors, we've got to report this using the right mechanisms in our organizations. So that may be through our management chain to the head of audit. Head of audit may have to have conversations with the board around this, and obviously ensure that we don't stay quiet, we don't cover this up, we don't pretend that we haven't seen it, but to take proper professional action. So the challenge for us, how are we going to do this in practice? How do we set a tone within the audit team about encouraging people to be aware of the risks here and to raise them through the audit management train? How are we going to support our team if they do this? And, what's the process in our organization for escalating concerns of this nature? Is there a process within the audit service about this? Is there other processes that we can use within the organization? Picking the right approach to deal with this professionally. Okay, objectivity, of course, has been an element of our standards for a long time. But one bit that I was also really pleased to see mentioned was this final bit in bold on the black there. Internal auditors must be aware of and manage potential biases. Because, of course, we all have biases, and the longer we work in an organization, arguably the more biased we become, because we bump into people who we've met before and we already have opinions and views about these people. We're often auditing in areas that we've reviewed before, and last time they may have been wonderful, may influence our thinking. Maybe last time they were terrible, can influence us and create bias. So it's a challenge for us to manage, all the time in our thinking. But maybe think a little bit about your own biases and your own prejudices and the challenges you face to your own objectivity. In my last job, I was head of audit for 10 years, and I felt that towards the end of that, there was a risk that my objectivity could be affected, that perhaps I was slipping into the risk of some of these biases. So I decided to finish there before these risks sort of materialized. But so a little bit of information about different types of buyers there at the foot of the slide. As I say, you'll have, I'm sure, the access to these slides afterwards, so you can read a bit more about that later. All right, let's click on. Oh, this is another good one. I like this new standard, this idea of professional skepticism. Professional skepticism wasn't mentioned in previous IPPF, and yet it is a critically important subject. It is obviously linked to objectivity, and it's linked to conducting our work with due professional care. It's about making sure that we don't sort of blindly accept what we're told. Where did you get this information from? Well, the interviewee told me. What did you do to kind of corroborate it or to test it? Well, nothing. Well, that's not good enough for the Institute. It's not good enough for me. It doesn't demonstrate that we've been sufficiently professionally skeptical. It's about us critically assessing the reliability of information. It's about us checking, raising concerns and saying, well, you told me this, but I'm seeing that. How can you explain that, or what's going on here? It's about following up our questions, not ad infinitum, but to the point where we become satisfied with the responses. I think information should always be treated with a degree of skepticism. Sorts of things that I think about, I put at the bottom of the slide here. Does this feel or look okay? How does it compare to what we thought or our expectations? What could be missing? How comfortable do I feel that this is accurate or complete? Where else can I go to find some other evidence that can support this or discredit it? What about the person or people who are telling me this? Confident am I that they're telling me the truth? Where did they get this from? Who created it? These are the sorts of questions that we should be asking to ourselves and quite explicitly with the people who are providing us with information and evidence. Moving on, we've got our third domain, the one that Katleen mentioned about governing the audit function. Three principles. We've got this idea of a mandate and a charter, positioning and status of the Internal Audit Service, together with the qualifications, experience of the Chief Audit Exec, and then our relationships with the board and the sorts of conversations we should be having with the board about key elements of the audit service, resourcing, our quality assurance and improvement program, and the need to have an external quality assessment at least once every 5 years, all critically important parts of ensuring that the audit service is as professional and effective as it needs to be. So we've got standard 6.1, which introduces something that was sort of in the previous standards, but really not sort of called a mandate. Now it's explicitly described as a mandate. It's the role of the Chief Audit Exec to provide the board and senior management with the right information to establish an appropriate audit mandate. In the audit mandate, as it says sort of here, it's kind of about our purpose, authority, responsibility, the sorts of things that we would include within our charter, of course. Then the mandate for internal audit, particularly in some of the countries that you are working in today, will come from a law. And of course, there's an interesting thing. At what point and how will laws be changed in many jurisdictions to reflect these new global internal audit standards? So if there is a law that governs internal audit in the country or in the public sector, then obviously the mandate will be drawn from the law, of course. Moving on to the second element, and again, we'll touch upon this a little bit later. But we've got this element that was within the previous standards and is very much emerging practice in many jurisdictions around the world. This idea of working more closely, more actively, more participatively with other assurance providers. not just the Supreme Audit Institution and the external auditors, but often with other review and assurance functions within an organisation. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the three lines model, of course, and there's often extensive teams of people in the second line. Risk teams, compliance teams, quality teams, inspection teams, security teams, well, what else? Business continuity, health and safety, these sorts of groups who provide assurance on certain areas of risk, of course. The wording here is quite clear. The chief audit exec must coordinate with other internal and external assurance providers so that we understand each other's role, so that we're not duplicating efforts, so that we can work more collegiately to provide better assurance to our key stakeholders, of course. Now, the mandate is something that will need to be considered and probably changed in all of our internal audit teams. The mandate will need to reflect these new global internal audit standards. The charter will have to be updated and refreshed to cover off the new dimensions and the new elements. And we need to be beginning to have those conversations with the board and with senior management about these new global internal audit standards and the need to change and improve the way in which we maybe govern aspects of internal audit in our organizations. We need to be marketing ourselves as a modern, dynamic, and ultimately a more effective internal audit service. We need to be telling them what we should be doing, what we can be doing to help. I'm going to sneeze, so I'm just going to mute myself. Thank you. As you see, I've got a very large nose, and if I had sneezed down the microphone at you, you would probably be deafened. So just as well, I found the mute just in the nick of time. So I apologise for that. Too often, internal audit teams don't engage as well as they should with other providers of assurance. Sometimes we kind of don't get on with them as well as we should. There's an element of jealousy or an element of disagreements or professional differences between teams. I think that's a shame. As an audit committee chair, I like to get assurance from different sources. And I like to have joined up assurance from different sources, all giving me sort of consistent, accurate messages. I want assurance providers to work together, and there's a role for us to take the lead in that, I think. Now, a few other bits within these domain three. We've got this idea of independence. And this first sort of set of highlighted in bold elements, this develops what within the previous standards. Internal audit and heads of internal audit can have other roles beyond internal auditing. And I know many of you will be nervous about that, but also I'm sure many of you do have other roles beyond internal auditing. In my last organisation, I was head of audit, head of risk, head of counter fraud, and I was the whistleblowing officer. Different roles that went beyond internal audit. Now, of course, that does present challenges to me as the head of audit. And the main challenge is, well, how do I know these things are working properly? Risk, counter fraud, whistleblowing. And what happens if somebody wants to take a look at this or wants us to provide assurance over these subjects? Well, that can't happen. So we need safeguards. We need to be able to bring in sort of independent sources of assurance to take a look over anything we may have responsibility for. So safeguards are acceptable, as are other roles, as long as we have these safeguards. So again, whether that's something that you do or certainly wouldn't want to do, the standards do allow it, as long as we approach it professionally and properly, of course. Another element within this standard is there in the middle, in bold. If we don't have the right place within the structure, right status, the right reporting lines, the right gravitas or seniority, then we do have to identify what these challenges present to the audit service and how it could impact our independence. And if we need to do things about it, what the likely safeguards would be. So we can deliver other tasks beyond audit, but we need to think carefully about the safeguards and ensure that, these safeguards can operate in a healthy way, in a professional way, and allow us to do the jobs, but also allow our stakeholders to get independent and objective assurance when they need it. Okay, I'm going to pick on a few more. There's a standard here about resourcing, as you can see. This is always an interesting subject for us because often there's never enough resources, or we always need more resources to do our job even better. But this standard places some real obligations on us as chief audit execs. We must evaluate whether our resources are sufficient, not just to deliver the plan, because often we'll plan based upon the resources we've got, but also to achieve the internal audit mandate. So if the mandate promises that we'll do all sorts of wonderful things, but if our resources are really tiny and we don't stand a chance of achieving those things, then we've got to evaluate this, and we then have to develop a strategy, as it says, to obtain the necessary resources, and to also have conversations and communications with the board about the impact of insufficient resource. So we can't just shrug our shoulders anymore and say, well, I'd do this if I had the resources. Not having the resources has consequences. It has consequences for assurance, for advisory work, for our ability to deliver insight and foresight. And we need to make our stakeholders aware of that. Remember, it could be a difficult conversation. We need to have the courage to have these difficult conversations. So let's not be nervous about having difficult conversations with our key stakeholders. It will help them understand what's needed, to help them get the service they want from us. Okay, standard 8.3, quality, builds upon the sort of quality assurance and improvement program standards we had before, the old 1300 series. But one thing that always upsets me, to tell you the truth, is the amount of audit teams around the world that have not had a proper external quality assessment. In my audit career, I've done probably about 45 external quality assessments. It's a large part of my current work, so I do these things quite regularly, both for the Institute of Internal Auditors in the UK, but also, myself from my own business. But in my experience, there are many more audit teams out there that haven't had external quality assessment. Remember, these things aren't optional. Part of the standards, just as important as integrity and objectivity, just as important as courage and independence. And yet, my impression is that many audit teams and heads of internal audit don't focus on fulfilling and performing with this element as they should. It's easy to find excuses not to have this. Not anymore. Please make sure that you have one at least once every 5 years. It should be about improvement and helping you deliver a better audit service to your stakeholders. Why wouldn't you want to have one of those? All right, now you'll be pleased to know there's a little bit less that I've highlighted in the last couple of domains. We've got domain 4. It's about managing the audit function and service. It's about planning, resources, communications, and the rest of the elements around quality. So just picking out a couple of these elements, and this is another one that really, really interests me. Too many audit functions that I've seen have some sort of strategy or strategic plan that simply covers the sorts of things they might want to audit in year 1, year 2, and year 3. That's not a strategy. This is what an internal audit strategy should have been and will be, should be going forward. You've got to develop a strategy for the audit function that supports the strategic objective and success of the organisation. It should align with what the board, senior management, and our stakeholders want from us. It's a development of the mandate and the charter, and it says how we're going to sort of audit in this organisation, how we're going to play our part in supporting the organisational strategy and the long-term objectives of the organisation. It ought to contain a vision for the audit service, key strategic objectives, the things that we're going to focus on ourselves over the next 2, 3, 4 years, and the sorts of key initiatives we may want to be introducing as an audit function, whether that's more IT audit work, some data analytics capability, tools to help us audit culture or cybersecurity or third parties more effectively. The main priorities for us as an audit service. These might be rolling out of our quality assurance and improvement program, of course. So think a little bit about whether you've got something like that. If you've got a traditional sort of strategic plan with these audits in year 1, 2, and year 3, that's not enough. It's about taking what you've got in the mandate, the charter, the results of your own quality assurance and improvement program, and the areas of priority and focus that you want in the audit service to help you deliver a better um, assurance and advisory function that helps the organization achieve its strategic goals. That's big and that's exciting. That's sexy. I kind of like the sound of that. Moving briefly on, I'm going to go 5 minutes over, if that's okay. 3 minutes over if I talk quickly. Plans, yes, we've all had audit plans in the past. Lots of audit teams will continue to develop an annual plan. Maybe the law requires that. Maybe our board expect that. But nowhere does the standard say that we have to have an annual plan. I also know many audit teams that have moved completely away from annual planning and do quarterly plans or sort of rolling 6-month plans. Standard doesn't mandate a particular time. What the standard mandates, though, is that there has to be documented assessment of the organization's key strategies, its key objectives, and its key risks. We can't do this ourselves. We have to put it together and develop it from engaging with our key stakeholders. This assessment needs to be annual. The plan doesn't. So it's about making sure that we're basing our plan and our activity on the things that matter, the important things in our organization. It doesn't have to be an annual plan. I like this one too. We touched upon this, so I won't repeat the message here, but it says here we must coordinate with internal and external providers of assurance. And something that I rarely see happening, but I think we ought to maybe be a little bit more open-minded about this and consider relying upon their work only where it's right to do so, where their work is professional, where it's conducted to a standard, where they are objective, where they report and follow up on their own actions. Then we can begin to rely on their work. I've relied on one assurance provider in my last organisation, our health and safety team. They were really effective. They were professional. They had qualifications and operated a good methodology. I relied on their work. I did test it from time to time, but it meant that we spent less time as internal audit doing work in that sort of area because I was confident in the ability of this second line team to do their job and to do it properly. So don't be nervous about it, but at the same time, think a little bit about what needs to happen for you to work much more closely with second line colleagues and, what they need to do to enable you to rely on their work. Standards say we can do it if they're professional in how they can do their work. This is a new one. It's about technology and technological resources. Just looking at the bits that are highlighted, the chief audit exec must regularly evaluate the technology used by the audit function and do what we can to improve effectiveness and efficiency. And that may be simply in how we use the sort of typical office style software applications we have. It might be about exploring audit management software, or file interrogation software, or data analytics software, or maximizing our use of sharing tools, etc. So it's about making sure that we're not left behind in the sort of technological development that are happening. GPT, AI, very much flavors of this year. 5 years ago, probably not even thought of or not mentioned hardly at all in our internal audit world. Let's make sure that we're not left behind like the dinosaurs and that we continue to evolve our approaches and our knowledge, skills, and experience in these areas. We haven't got the right IT. We must communicate these limitations to the board. We shouldn't be conducting samples of 10, 15, or 30 transactions when there are millions of transactions on our large databases. We need the tools to be able to do that, provide reliable and effective assurance to our key stakeholders. That's what that standard is encouraging us to do quite firmly and quite clearly. Final one. Okay, we know about our sort of audit process and performing audit services. I've just pulled out one of the standards from this area before I wrap up. And this is another one that interests me. I must admit, this was one that I felt a little bit disappointed about because in the draft version of the standards, the wording was a little bit firmer, and Katleen may remember this. But in the draft, it said something like, we must identify the root causes. And I thought that's pretty important. That's a high standard to achieve. And I noticed that the wording has changed a little bit in the final version, probably realistically and understandably. But I did like the original words. So here, we are expected to do something that not every audit service does today. We've got to work with management to identify the root causes, where possible, of our engagement findings. So we can't simply say things like, people made mistakes. We need to try to understand why. These forms weren't signed. Well, why were the forms not signed? This fraud occurred. Well, okay, let's dig a little bit deeper to understand what allowed the fraud to occur. If we can identify root causes, then we stand a much greater chance of fixing these causes once and for all, so that we don't see the same errors, mistakes, problems time after time after time. Is it quick and easy to identify root causes? No, not always. It may require us to spend a little bit more time on some of our engagements doing this, but I think it's time well spent, and it can lead to a much better improvements in our organization and solving the problems that we find once and for all. And I'm about improvement, and I like solving problems. So I'm pleased to see that in there. And it's something that I think we should all work a little bit harder to do more regularly in work. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing the screen now. I will pause for breath, and then I'm sure Alistair will come on and facilitate questions while I have a drink of vodka. Water, sorry.
Thank you very much, John, for that fairly comprehensive. But also, you showed there's so much content there. You can't even touch it in a short webinar. But I'll come back to that at the end of the closing and how we're going to address some of that going forward. But I want to open it to the floor, to everybody to ask questions. Either raise your hand or put a question in the chat or in the Q&A. Please do that.
It's a difficult question. I'll pass it over to Katleen. I only take the easy ones that make me look
Okay,
knowledgeable.
you pass all the difficult ones to the Institute of Internal Auditors. Okay. Okay. Well, while everybody has a minute to think and question, I obviously, unsurprisingly, John, I have a few questions and I always do. I always like to challenge you and make life
Alistair.
difficult for you. So, looking through the standards, what do you see as going to be the biggest challenge for internal audit functions? You don't have to give me one, you can give me a few. In terms of something that's different in the standards,
Yeah.
and what do you think will be the biggest challenge for, especially for internal audit functions, which are still developing and such like?
Yeah. No, I think it's a fair question. I'd welcome sort of Kathleen's perspective on this as well. I think the main three, I know it's sort of been amended through the sort of the drafting and finalization process. But I think the main three are still going to require many internal audit functions and CAEs to be engaging much more closely with boards, governing bodies, whatever we want to call it, and making them aware much more about what a modern audit service can deliver, also their responsibilities vis-a-vis modern internal audit service. And maybe in the past we've shied away from having those difficult conversations of not flagging the need for more resources or some proper IT, or to be doing work that actually adds value, not some of the traditional just compliance stuff. And I think that domain three is probably going to be the one that makes many heads of audit think a little bit more, and hopefully give them the impetus to go and have better conversations with some of our key stakeholders. I'd welcome Kathleen's view though on that as well.
Absolutely. Kathleen?
Yes, I fully agree with you, John. And first of all, I want to say that you did an excellent job, I think, with picking those standards and probably aspects as well that will be the most challenging one. But in the same time, will also probably be the ones that will enable internal auditors to enhance or at least to ensure the quality of their internal audit work. So great job there. And your personal opinions are aligned with mine as well. So
even better. Phew. Thank you for the validation.
Yes.
Always
And so
nervous when we do these sorts of things.
right. So and to come back to the question, I think that a bit what you were saying as well, John, is that there's a clear shift as well, that the responsibility of the quality is just much more emphasized now as the responsibility of the internal audit function. So I liked what you said, that it's no longer up to the internal auditors to shrug the shoulders and say, well, we don't have enough resources. It's the responsibility of the internal audit function to address it as well if there is such an issue. So definitely a big change there, I think, and a big challenge there. And another one is probably the quality, that there is a lot more focus now on the performance perspective, which for, I think, mature functions, like for instance, in the financial sector, this will probably be fine too, because now you will have to start monitoring your performance. And I think that in particular in smaller internal audit departments and public sector ones probably as well, this will be a challenge to see, okay, what are now the good KPIs, what are good measures to address, to follow up, and also to discuss with their boards and with senior management on how they are adding value. What is the perspective of the board and the senior management on how they add value to the organization?
Okay.
I think that's really fair. Just one more, if I'm allowed an extra one.
Yeah.
I love that standard around courage. It's something that I think is so critically important for us as auditors. And I've seen courageous auditors and I've seen auditors who have shied away from raising difficult matters just for an easy life. And I know which one's the right thing to do.
Good. Okay, so before I go to Ilya, who's raised his hand, I just wanted to follow up about this issue around quality. People have struggled already, and there's an ongoing challenge in the public sector to do internal assessments and rather than not even do external quality reviews.
Plutôt que de faire des revues de qualité externe. Et bien souvent, c'est à cause d'une question de ressources. Donc ce sera intéressant de voir comment est-ce qu'on s'adapte à cela. Puisque comme vous l'avez dit, Katleen, dans le secteur financier, probablement que ce ne sera pas un problème puisqu'ils ont assez de ressources pour le faire. Mais j'ai encore de vraies préoccupations pour le secteur public. Donc avez-vous des points de vue sur comment mettre cela en œuvre dans le secteur public, même au Royaume-Uni? Bien souvent, c'est en externe, alors que nous avons un secteur public bien développé, bien au fait de cette fonction d'audit. De mon point de vue, il y a des options pour les évaluations externes. Il y a la possibilité, clairement établie dans la norme, de travailler avec d'autres organisations partenaires, tant qu'il y a assez de personnes impliquées pour ne pas revoir ou examiner nos propres travaux, évidemment. Mais les évaluations de qualité externe ne doivent pas forcément coûter très cher. Il y a de nombreux fournisseurs indépendants qui existent, de petits fournisseurs indépendants qui font du très bon travail. Et il y a également des instituts d'audit interne qui fournissent ce type de service. Donc, il y aura encore la possibilité d'avoir des évaluations de qualité externe. Oui, et dans les considérations, il y a également des exemples de revues d'examen par les pairs. Comme vous vous en souvenez peut-être, l'auto-évaluation n'était permise que tous les 10 ans par le passé. Maintenant, c'est tous les 5 ans. Et de mon point de vue, c'est une très bonne nouvelle puisque la valeur ajoutée de l'auto-évaluation est énorme. Puisqu'on ne fait qu'auto-évaluer notre propre valeur ajoutée, la propre valeur qu'on apporte en tant que fonction d'audit interne. Donc, c'est une très bonne chose pour ensuite avoir la validation externe. D'accord, donc c'est encore... Il y a encore l'option d'avoir une validation externe. Très bien, c'est une possibilité intéressante puisqu'il faudra toujours trouver les ressources en interne, mais ça peut coûter évidemment moins cher. Bien, y a-t-il des...
Any questions from the floor or from... Nothing's coming through. Okay, well... Okay, and then, okay. Well, continue on this issue of quality then, because as always, it's an interest to me. You mentioned KPIs, Katleen. Does the Institute develop a selection of potential KPIs and those potentially for the public service, or is that you're leaving that to everybody's own discretion?
Well, there are already some examples in the standards now, and in the exposed version there were ones as well, and we received quite some pushback there that they were not the good ones. And I agree with that, but on the other hand, it's very difficult to provide within the standards with a good set of standards, with a good set of quality KPIs, because this is different for each organization. This just doesn't fit for all, and in particular for public sector, it's even more challenging. So I think that the solution there is really to reflect on a comprehensive, a holistic view within your organization, to pick some really maybe ones following up on the clear outputs, but also more trying to measure your added value and to go into conversation with your board and senior management on how they see added value, and try to find measures on how you can follow up on that and have the communication with them on that. So it's just, we're not going to elaborate one document with a set of standards and say, hey, these are the standards that you, or the KPIs that you have to implement and follow up, and then you will have a good view on your quality. That's not going to work.
No, I don't think standards is never the place for the KPIs, but whether there's a resource on potential topics and on potential areas of KPIs is something.
It will be guidance. It will be guidance then. Yeah, indeed.
Okay. Okay. I obviously saw a few areas where there's opportunities for support from certain parties to institute, like around in terms of looking at and reflecting on the charters for the government, the new standards, and then also internal audit strategies, which is all we generally see lots of. It's just about multi-year audit plan in reality.
Mhm.
So there's
Yeah.
opportunities there for some support from our side. But I want to come back to the final question before we have to move on to the next session from me. As nobody's, we've got a Q&A. What are the key highlights, new elements addressed in considerations on applying the standard in the public sector? I think.
Okay, I mean, within the draft version of the standards, to many of the individual standards, you would have noticed that there was a public sector sort of element included during the finalization process, and that has been adapted slightly, and now there's a section later on in the standards around public sector considerations, and that contains much of the emphasis in there. From my view, my personal view is, I think really the challenges are pretty similar in general to audit functions everywhere. And I don't think there should be separate public sector internal audit standards. We have those in the UK. I'm hoping that these new global internal audit standards with the public sector elements at the back will replace the need for any kind of separate body of standards and guidance for the public sector. So I think there's enough in the new ones for many elements of public sector internal auditing. And that's my background. And certainly I've looked at it, and then I thought it sort of passes passes muster from my perspective. It's good enough from my perspective. That's my view.
Okay, fantastic. Katleen, do you want to say anything?
Yes, well, yeah. And I agree with you, John. And actually, the comments that we received when we had the specific call-outs in the exposed version was that the challenges that we are addressing there are actually not so specific for public sector. They're probably more general. So that's why we moved to that dedicated part for public sector, more to address the context, not so much to address key challenges, but more to say, okay, public sector is a different context. Sometimes you cannot decide on your resources. There's a different organizational structure with your board and things like that. So more addressing the context than actually how to address them, because that's always different as well.
And the next question we got in the Q&A is, what will the role of the audit committee be? And I was going to come to this question of the governance of internal audit, because that's always been the challenge in the public sector. Where not many countries actually have the audit committee, and also often it's to the minister or to the senior civil servant, which causes challenges as well in terms of independence, etc. So, your perspectives on that from the standard, how the standards help to address that now, and what is seen as the role of the audit committee in the standards as well.
I think that's one for Katleen.
Well,
just to go first while I reflect on things.
Okay. So, and as you have seen in the fundamentals, there's now this part on how to comply with the standards. And what is actually new there as well, that it opens a bit of room on explaining why you cannot conform and have some, let's say, other actions in place to make sure that you still comply with the principle level, even if you're not complying with the standards, right? So this we don't want to call it comply or explain, because you have to comply. But on the other hand, it does give some room for instance, in these specific public sector context situations that it's the law stating and designing the organizational structure. So this is something that is out of the span of control of the internal audit function. So if you can explain that for certain reasons, this is not, you're not in compliance with the standards, but you do all the additional things, like for instance, you develop an independent audit committee, you make sure that you have an audit independent position, that it's still fine because you are still in compliance with the principle level.
So it's about the spirit, isn't it? Complying with the spirit of it.
Yes.
Okay. Fine, thanks for that. And got another question here about, I noticed the first domain of internal audit purpose, the change from consultancy to advisory. Why was that change taking place, and why does it refer to that?
That's a very simple one, mainly because consultancy was often referred to or linked to consultancy firms, So to make sure that people understand that it's not only about the work delivered by consultancy services as firms, on the contrary, it's about advising. So in many languages, the term or the word advice is better explaining that it's about providing advice to your board and senior management, and it's not just calling in the big four to come in and provide for consultancy services.
Okay, thanks for that, Katleen. Okay, well, thanks for that. There were some good questions there, and thanks, John, for that. I thought it was a very effective presentation of.
Thank you. I know there was a lot to cover, and I'm
a lot of coverage.
For talking quickly, but
we'll come to that later, and it's better than talking quickly. So now I come back to you, Katleen, to talk us on what next, basically, in terms of where do we go from here.
Right. I will share my screen again. Just a second. I have two screens on here, and it's always a bit complicated. Can you see my screen on the top of the screen?
That's, I think if there we go. That's us. Yeah. All good.
Okay, right. So I already addressed a bit on things that are coming, and also John already referred to that we have now these topical requirements coming up. So as you have seen in one of the first slides, the IPPF framework will still continue to exist, but we have now three key parts. We have the Global Internal Audit Standards, which is obviously the core part, but we also have two other parts, which is the global guidance. These are our previous GTAGs and our practice guides. They will also be updated and continue to exist as global guidance. And then this third part is the new part. This is the topical requirements. And these are developed mainly to address the objective that the Standards Board had to address, I would say, not so much emerging topics, but key risk areas that we see coming up. So the key objectives or the why we have or why we will develop topical requirements is, first of all, the quality. We want to ensure that our stakeholders can rely on good quality services within these often specific and often complex risk areas. And then the other reason is to ensure coherence, because the standards are global. So we want to make sure that all over the world, whether you audit in Europe or whether you audit in the US here, that these engagements are at least addressing a same level of quality. So the coherent side is also a very important one. Now, what are they actually? They are mandatory. When you address these specific risk areas, this does not mean that you will have to audit all these topics for which we will in the future develop topical requirements. You will still have to do your risk-based audit assessment. And then whatever these topics then show up in your risk-based planning, then you will have to be in compliance with the specific topical requirements, for instance, like for cybersecurity, because that is the pilot that we have currently developed and that will come out in March, hopefully March or April for exposure. What you will find there is key requirements on how to address governance, risk management, and controls in these specific risk areas. So those some requirements, as well as some considerations as well. So you will find some guidance as well, because during the survey, we did see that there was quite a lot of consent that we need that as an internal auditor, not so much as well as a requirement, but also some guidance. It's not enough to just say, these are the requirements that you will have to follow, but there's a clear need in specific risk areas to have some more guidance on how to address governance, risk management, and control. The topics that are currently on the table are cyber, sustainability, third-party management, IT. And actually, as I said, we had a question during the survey of the exposed version on the topical requirements, collecting feedback as well on the topics as on the level of consent. And we had a dedicated survey as well. So these topics are not final. Also, the priorities are still not clear. We're using different, let's say, perspectives to prioritize them. And one of the elements or the aspects that came up as well during the surveys to maybe develop in the future topical requirements one is talent management and control environment. These are our two risk areas that clearly came up front when we asked auditors whether there would be a need for more, let's say, high quality standards as well as guidance. So more on that later on. Another aspect that is obviously highly impacted are the quality assessments. So as I mentioned, the standards will become effective on January 9th, 2025. So at that time, you will have to be sure, or you will have to be in line and in compliance with the new standards. So for your quality assessment now, there are two scenarios. When your quality assessment is still due this year, then you can opt as well to still be assessed against the current 2017 version, or you can already opt to be assessed against the new Global Internal Audit Standards. Now, when your quality assessment is due after 9th of January 2025, then of course you will have to be in compliance with the new standards and you will be assessed against the new standards. But if you would opt, or even if you have your quality assessment in 2025 and you will be assessed later on, I would strongly emphasize on the importance to start preparing, to dive into the standards and to do your kind of gap analysis to see where you still have some work to be done to make sure that you are in compliance when the standards become effective. The key on the content side then of the quality assessment, the key risk areas or the key standards aspects that will be impacted by the new standards and that you will have to maybe take a closer look to is first of all the essential conditions, I would say, the domain 3. So there you will find a lot of information on these essential conditions and how to address them. Because as you've seen from the exposed version to the final draft, we've moved a lot of the responsibility again to the internal audit function. So of course, the board and senior management still have to comply with certain things and will have to do certain things, but it will be up to the internal audit function to address that with the board and senior management and to document that and to have that conversation. And all these things will then be assessed during your quality assessment. So a very important aspect there. Also, as I already addressed during the Q&A, is that we have now in the fundamentals this kind of room of explaining in certain circumstances if you are not able to comply with the standard level on how to demonstrate that you have taken all the alternative actions to make sure that you are still in compliance on the principal level. So also something that you will take into consideration and a closer look to. Quality now, already mentioned as well. Of course, conformance still remains very important. You will have to comply with the standards and you will have to document and make sure that you are in your quality assessment able to document and to prove and to provide for the evidence that you are in compliance. But now there is this additional aspect of performance and making sure that you start now developing measures, making sure that you start developing the monitoring side, on the communication side on this is something that will probably take some more time and reflection as well. Internal audit strategy. As I said, I liked very much that John said we cannot longer shrug the shoulders and say, well, it's out of our span of control. No, we will definitely have to address some of our key challenges within our strategy and documenting that will be important as well, as this also will be assessed during your quality assessment. And then I think in the domain 5, you find a lot of more, I would say, explanations on how you will have to document certain things, on how, for instance, this root cause that John was mentioning, on how you prioritize your recommendation and action plan. So all these type of things that you might already have in place, but that will probably have to be fine-tuned as well. And to support you there, we are developing additional resources. So hopefully in March, we will have the quality assessment readiness assessment tool ready, where you can already do some assessments and define your gaps and prepare for implementation. And then the QA manual, of course, the one that you know now as well, will be thoroughly reviewed because we have now the new structure of the standards as well. But indeed, we have now this performance perspective that we fully want to integrate into the interview and access and appendices. So more information on that soon to come as well. The certifications will change as well. And actually, we are looking into a thorough content change, not only linked to the new standards, of course, but also to the structure of the CIA. And probably the last part 3, is the one that will change quite thoroughly. This is the business acumen. And also there we want to address more the needs of the new internal audit function. So to make sure that we are aligned there with, for instance, the IT challenges that we face. So some changes there on the content coming up. And those changes in the structure of the CIA will then be integrated in the changes that we will have linked to the new standards. So quite some work still to be done there. So you should not expect any big changes there before May 2025. We are preparing for that. And to reassure you as well for internal auditors that are for the moment in the running for their CIA, there will be a transition period where we will provide for some time for the ones that are, for instance, have already done one of the first parts. Our CIDA materials, of course, will have to be updated and will also be online and available as soon as the new CIA will become effective. Internal audit practitioner, also there we foresee a thorough review on the structure as well as on the content, but also there no changes that you would have to expect before the standards will become effective in January next year. And then the CRMA, our third certificate, is the one that is actually not impacted because that is all about the risk framework, the risk assessment. So you should not expect any changes there. Now, I think this was a very intense session, a lot of information, and we will provide you with some more opportunities as well in the near future. So I would say, or encourage you to every now and then check our website because we will be organizing webinars and there are new courses available anytime soon now. There will be workshops and conferences that we organize, definitely addressing the new standards as well. So I encourage you to every now and then check our website for more resources available there. Thank you very much. Now moving it back to you, Alistair, for maybe some additional questions.
Thanks, Katleen, and for that, and fascinating to see what's coming, and especially those areas where you're developing specific standards and guidance. Very interesting, and actually and quite a number of areas, same as the sort of guidance and the standards are being developed for the external auditors and the SI community as well. It's interesting that we all think in the same way somehow, sometimes. Maybe we even talk to each other occasionally as well. Before there was one question that came in just at the end of just after you started again there, Katleen, your presentation. But in terms of documenting advisory services, do people need to document their advisory services effectively? And I'm presuming the answer would be yes.
Yes, yes. To a certain point, however, there is a big change compared to the exposed version because, as you recall, there we did no longer make the distinction between advisory and assurance functions, which has had a consequence at that time that you would have to do the full documentation that you had to do as well for your assurance as for your advisory services. Now, we have made again in the new final version the distinction. So you will have to see within each principle and within each standard whether there is a deviation for advisory services. So you will find it explicitly mentioned in the specific standards there where there is deviation and where are certain things needed or not needed.
Okay, fine. So does anybody have any final questions covering anything, to be honest, from today's sessions, which I found thoroughly enjoyable? I think we're in silence, I think we've done them in. No.
They are all digesting, I think.
I think they're all digesting the what's required of them, because the couple
bombarded with information.
Yeah, so from my perspective, listening in, and a couple of words that come to my mind in terms of the new standards is courage, bravery, and responsibility as well, I'd say, in terms of the internal auditors, shifting some of the responsibility back to IA to make things clear to their management about where there are issues and challenges. So that comes back to the bravery as well. So, you know, it creates a bit of interesting challenges and pressure for our communities in dealing with some of this, and it'll be interesting to see how we can take this forward. So unless there's no other questions, I think I'll just want to bring this to a close then, and to reflect on the fact that John gave us a run through of some of the key changes in the standards, but obviously there's a lot to the standards, and we've obviously the IIA have got some more webinars and courses coming up, but in Sigma we will be holding another. We plan to try and hold 4 more webinars around the standards, covering individual sections of the new Global Internal Audit Standards. So we plan to have webinars to talk about on ethics and professionalization. Then we'll have another one on governing the internal audit function, followed by one on managing the internal audit function, and finally a final webinar on performing internal audit services, where we'll look to explore the expectations of the standards, the practical implications and the practical implementation challenges of the standards, and how we can potentially overcome some of these challenges. So that's what we plan to do, and we'll be in touch shortly to share information about the next webinar, and the future webinars will be held from our side. But I would also suggest, if you have any specific things that you would like addressed or discussed in one of these forthcoming webinars, to please get in touch with us and let us know specific concerns you may have after having had a look at the standards. But if there are any further questions, all it remains for me to do is to thank everybody for you, the participants, for turning up to listen in. But I'd like to thank John and Katleen for their excellent presentations today. Most enlightening. I'm an external auditor, so I know lots about external audit standards, but I'm less, well, I've done internal audit before, but it's been a long time. As John knows when he works with me.
We don't hold that against you, Alistair.
But it's enlightening to see what the changes are and what that actually means. Thank you very much for those presentations. I'd like to thank my colleagues, Ilana, and for lots of the organizational things, and Pilar as well, who was supposed to be able to lead this webinar, but unfortunately wasn't able to. But she did lots of the organization behind the scenes as well. And also I'd like to thank our interpreters, Remy and Gabriella, for their services today. Always appreciate the work that they do for us. But without further ado, thank you very much for listening in, and I'd like to thank you all. And I've just had a message in that the recording of the webinar will be available and sent to all registered participants as well, so you can share that with other people as well. So thank you very much for joining us today, and it was a pleasure to have you here. And have a good rest of your evening or afternoon in Kathleen's morning.
Morning.
Morning still. I'm going for dinner at 7 o'clock. So